So today is lesson 11, and we are going to resume work on our full stack single page application with our Node Express server app and our Angular client. So for starters, we can open up our code editor, and I'm going to open up I've actually got mine open already. So we want to open both our jobs server project as well as our jobs client. Take a moment and we'll open up those projects. And of course, not for the first time this semester, where we ended class, something didn't seem to be working. But an hour after class, I restarted the projects, tried them again with no code changes, and they worked. So my assumption is somehow things were being cached by my browser. But I'm just going to start both applications up in their respective terminals. We'll make sure that both are running. And the result that we should actually get is our employer names should now be displayed in our Angular application. Again, I haven't made any code changes to get this to work. I went in to try and we were having issues around cross-origin resource sharing, that the two applications would load separately, but our Angular front end didn't have permission to make API calls. So we enabled this CORS, cross-origin resource sharing, and it didn't seem to be working. And I stopped and restarted both applications, and magically it worked. So I'm going to go into my job server app first, and I'll use nodemon to start the node server. Once I do that, I can check it out by going to my localhost 3000 /API/employers. So we could get our JSON representation. And we can see now that obviously our server API is working when we can get this JSON object in our browser. And then if I go to my client application, we'll use the Angular command to start our Angular server, which is ngserve. So this will compile the application and start our second local web server running on port 4200. So my terminal tells me my server is running. I've already got it opened. And last week at the end of class, our data wasn't showing up. And when I looked in the console, we were getting a CORS, a cross-origin resource sharing error, that our Angular app that ran on port 4200 didn't have permission to access our server app running on port 3000. We did add code to the server application at the end of last week's class. As I said, it didn't seem to be working in real time. And yet when I stopped and restarted my application, it did work. So that the way that we enabled our Angular front-end application access to make calls to our backend was in the app.js of our server. We used the CORS npm package and we installed it. And then after requiring our .env, we enabled the use of CORS from the client URL in our environment file. So we said, only allow API requests if they're coming from this URL, from localhost 4200. And we were going to allow all of these API methods. Now, so far, we're only using get. But today, we will be implementing these other methods. Post, put, and delete. And head will allow us to also pass a header, which we're going to need to do when we are using post or put, so that we can specify the content type. when sending data. So this is the result that we should get now when we run our Angular app, is we should have a simple bulleted list displaying the employer names from our backend API. So everything is on GitHub already. I didn't make any changes to it. So we should be seeing our list of employers here in our Angular front end. Now, we'll also want to style this a bit and add some more information about the employer, not just their names. So we can use a bit of Bootstrap for this. So here was our Angular front end. Here's our HTML, where so far all we were using was a really simple UL. So what I'm going to do, I want to split this page up so that on the left side we'll have our employers display, and then on the right side we eventually will add a form where we can add, edit, and delete employers. So I'm going to add a few classes around all this. So I'm going to indent this section, and then inside of the main I'm going to add a row at the top. I'll move my closing tag down to the bottom. And I'm going to nest this in another div. So we'll make it 5 columns wide, so not quite half the page width. We'll give it a little shading in the back with a margin and some padding. And again, I'll drag my closing div down here. I can put the class right in here. I'll throw it in the chat for you. Morning, Tanya. So a couple divs at the top. And then I'm also going to style my unordered list. We'll give it a class of list group. And then in our li tag, we're going to add a Bootstrap class here as well, which will be a list group item. We can also use a heading tag around our employer name. Maybe we'll use something like an H5 tag. So this should reformat the list of employers a little bit. Our bullets should be gone. We'll have some borders and some shading. I'll actually put all the HTML in the chat if you need to reference it. I'm going to save that and go have a look and see how this renders in the browser now. And if we're happy with it, we can then start to output other properties of the employer besides just the name. So our BG Lite gives us this, and this list group and list group item tags. These give us a little border and some padding. And then we can display other information about the employers inside of these list item tags. So maybe under this heading, I want something like, we'll put in an H6. We can put in the employer location. And we can put in the employer description. So we'll add both of those attributes. Okay, so now we get the location, a description, and then some of our employers, we have a website link for them. If we have a website, we can display that text, and then we can also make it a link. So first we'll just put it on like this as a paragraph, maybe to start. So now we've got a URL here for some of these. And we also want to make this a link, but we're only going to show this if the employer has a website. And we can see that we've listed websites for some of these, but not for all of them. So we could actually use an Angular directive to show or hide this element depending on whether or not the website is null. So we can use star ng if. So this means this code translates if the employer website value is not null, then render this, make this element visible. If there is no website, then this element is not visible. And then we can also, turn this into a functional link. So now we will wrap the URL in an anchor tag that will open in a new window if we do have a website listed for the employer. If the website is empty, then this code just gets skipped. So when we go back to our browser, wherever we see those company URLs, those should now be functional links that will open new tabs. Oh. Interesting. They might want to fix their SSL certificate. So we can click on one of these and it will jump us to that web page. So we're just using a combination, mostly it's HTML markup and continuing to reference our server-side values with our handlebars tags. And we're using some of the logic directives that come in Angular. ng for our loop, and ng if to show or hide a particular element, depending on whether a particular value is null or actually has some value. We're going to format one other thing in here in a moment, but not yet. Eventually, we want to make the employer names clickable. We'll come back and do this later. because we're going to add an employer details form over here. So when we click on any employer name, we want to populate the form so that we might be able to save changes, which will then update our list. And our list is our page will refresh when we save changes without our page having to do a total refresh. The data will just update in real time. Any questions so far? So we're pretty much done with the reading of data. And just to review sort of what we did last week to make this work, there was quite a bit of code we started all the way back in our Node API. So we wrote a get method that used Mongoose to call find. We fetched a list of employers, and we returned this list as a JSON object with the status of 200, which meant okay. And we tested this out in our browser. Here's our JSON that gets returned. So we can see the raw data from the API. We then had to work through 3 separate files in our Angular application to get the data all the way from our backend API serving out the JSON to be able to display dynamically here in an HTML. So the first layer we used was the Angular service. So our service used the Angular HTTP library, and it made a call to our API, a GET request to our API, and then it would return the JSON object. So our service was the file in our Angular application that would actually talk to our backend API. And once it fetched this data, it would hand it to our employer component. Our component would use the service. And whenever our component got initialized, we called our get method, which would call the get method on the service, and it would fetch, it would subscribe or listen for, it would wait for the data to come back from the service. And then we took that data and we set it into a property called employers. And the component was the interface, the bridge between our service and our HTML front end, which is our employer component. And then we could use this employer's object in our HTML so that we could loop through and display we could parse the JSON and read out the various properties like name, location, description, and website, which would come in our JSON object. So this was basically how we got our data to be read into our Angular application last week. So all we've done so far today is added some formatting, a little Bootstrap, as well as outputting the remaining fields. Last week, we were simply displaying the employer names. So this is working. We are going to make one change to it, and that is going to be in our employer service. So there's something here that we did sort of quick and dirty last week. And I recognize the service is new, but can you see anything on this page? I mean, there's not a lot of code. There's one thing here that is functional, but not done in an ideal way, and we should probably rewrite. Any ideas what's wrong with how we've done this? Like I said, functional. Yeah, the local host, right? We've hard-coded, that's right, we've hard-coded the server domain directly into our JavaScript code. So where should we put this domain instead of hard-coding it into the application code? Exactly. Now, in Angular, so in our node, in our server, we created the .env file, and we're using it for hosting these kinds of variables. Angular has a similar file with a slightly different name. There's actually two of them. In the root, there's a folder here called environments. And there are actually two environment TypeScript files. So there's environment.prod.ts. So this is for our production level variables. So Angular nicely gives us two. So the environment, this is for it defaults production false, right? So this is our development environment file. This is our production environment file. So later on, next week, we'll put our live domain in this file in the environment.prod, but we're only interested in this one for today, environment.ts. So we're going to add here a server URL variable, which will be HTTP localhost 3000. Okay, so rather than hard coding the domain into our service, we're going to place it in the environment file. So right after production false, let's add the server URL here. And then we can return to our service, and we can remove that hard coding of the domain, and we can read it from our environment file instead. I'll go back to the service. So this domain is going to be different in development and production. So notice there's two environment files here. So we want the first one. We don't want the production environment file. We want this one. And now we will set out here a variable for, what do I call it? Server URL is a string, and it's going to be equal to our environment.server URL. So we can set this variable so that we're not hard coding it. We can replace HTTP localhost 3000 with our server URL variable. There's a couple of ways to do this syntactically. The way that we're probably familiar with, I'll show you two ways. So now we can just append them together. So this works. There's another common way in the JavaScript world that we would concatenate a string that includes a variable. That's called string interpolation. Have you guys heard of string interpolation or used it in maybe like in your client-side JavaScript course with? Who did you have for client-side JavaScript last semester? Who was the teacher? It was Albert. Okay, yeah, I love Albert. Albert was a student of mine years ago. Did you ever discuss, it was called, string interpolation in JS? Have you ever heard of this or know what it means? Okay, so this version works. This syntax is kind of simple, but I'm going to show you the string interpolation version because you'll see it commonly in documentation, tutorials, and code samples. So we'll introduce it. So what we do here is instead of using single quotes, First of all, we wrap our strings in backticks. And then around the variable part, we do this. We use a $sign. Oh, okay, you did use it, yeah. And then our variable is enclosed in curly braces, prefixed with a $sign and a back. Okay, so maybe you just weren't aware of what that syntax is called. So it's called string interpolation. By using this syntax, we don't need to append or concatenate by using the backticks. I traditionally haven't used this syntax a lot with JavaScript, but it's become more and more popular. So this way it can inject and know that this is a variable, not a literal string. Okay, so you guys are probably familiar with it. That's good. So I'm going to save those changes. And if I've gotten this right, we should see no changes in our front end. Our employer list should still be loading exactly the same way once I save these changes. Okay, so again, we've added to the root environment.ts file, we've added our server URL. I've imported the file into my service and set up a string variable that reads that server URL from the environment file, and then we can use that variable in all of our API calls to the server, rather than hard coding that domain. We don't want to hard code the domain because then our app will work locally, but it won't work in production. By moving the environment file, our code is scalable, so we can move the application from server to server, and our code doesn't change. Okay, what did we? Oh, I may not have saved my environment. Let me make sure I saved my environment file. There. Really bad at this in Visual Studio Code. Gotten really bad at forgetting to click Control S. So our app still runs exactly the same way it did before now. So last week, we just hard-coded the domain into our HTTP call. I really need to. Thank you. Is it a preference I have to turn on or just? Okay. Thank you, Colton. Appreciate that. Okay, so now we can get, so our next step is we want to start building our form so that we can add a new employer over on the right side of our screen. And as soon as we click save, the employer will automatically get sent to the database and our list will refresh seemingly in real time. So our page will not have to do a reload. The data will just change. So we can start building out our form in the right side of our HTML. So we're doing this all on a single page. So what I'll do here is I'm going to copy this class with the call MD5, and I'll paste it in down here. So now I've got two sections, our list on the left and our form's going to be on the right. And over here we can put on a separate heading that says employer details. So we've got a heading on the left that says employers, a separate heading over on the right that says employer details. So I've just copied that div tag with all the same classes. So now you can see we've got two panels with a little bit of shading in the back. Our list on the left, and then we can build out our form over on the right. So we'll write out the HTML for our form first. Form. And we'll put on a number of field sets here. We'll style them after. We'll put on a label and an input. So we want 4 field sets for the employer name, location, description, and URL. And actually, this one is going to be a text area rather than an input. So the third one will be a text area. And then down at the bottom, we'll just put in a button here. And it'll just say add. And then we can put our labels on. We've got name, location, description, and website. So this is just plain HTML. We'll add a little more. I think we'll need to use a few classes for formatting, and obviously we're going to have to give names and IDs to the inputs as well. But we can see how the form looks. Okay, needs a little love. We'll add some classes here so that things fit a little better. On our labels, we'll try call to. Okay, so at least they're aligned. Actually, rather than primary, I'll use our yellow buttons we were using, which were, I think, warning buttons. Yeah, like we were using before. So now we can add some attributes to our inputs. So our first input, name equals name, ID equals name, and it's required. And I'll give the name, assign these properties as well for our other label and input sets. So name and location are required. Description and website are optional. So maybe I'll put a little star here beside name and location. Oops. Should be 4. So we're not using any Angular at all yet. We will. And we can set the type as URL here. So we're just adding some HTML attributes to kind of clean up and complete our form. So there's a visual indicator with a star that the first two fields are required, and we've added those required attributes. I've added a type attribute to the website to ensure that if the user does put in a value, it's properly formatted as a URL. And then we've just assigned a name, ID attributes to the input and 4 attributes to the labels. So we won't see much different here. It just shows me, notice it auto refreshes. We can see that name and location are required. And also we get validation for a URL. Now we're going to need to do a little more work with these inputs. We have to set up, if you remember from last week or 2 weeks ago, we have to set up our two-way data binding. So what we want to do is create a property for each value, a name, a location, a description, and a website property. We're going to define those properties in our component, and that way we can bind each input to a property of the component. And remember, Angular has two-way data binding. So when we enter the value in our form, it will update the value in our component. And if the value in our component changes, the visible value in our input form also changes. This is what we did 2 weeks ago in our first Angular lesson. We looked at two-way data binding. Remember, we had a list of employers at the top, and as soon as we clicked on one, it populated our form. So we're going to use that Angular data binding for this. So far this should be fairly simple. This is just HTML, obviously nothing you haven't seen before. So before we can set up the binding, we need to go into our Angular component and create properties for name, location, description, and website. And these are all going to be string properties. And then we'll be able to set up that binding. So we'll go to our component. Again, here's the full form now, before we add any Angular code. I'm going to go to my component. We've already got one property, which is a list of employers. So we're using this property when we call get. That's fetching our list, and we're looping through that employer's property here. But when we add, we now need all the other properties. So we're going to have a name, which is a string. We've got a location. All of these are strings. Description is a string, and a website as well. And Visual Studio Code isn't happy because it said the property is not initialized. So the way to fix this is we say or undefined. So it's a string, and if it has no value, we just say it's undefined. So this will prevent those TypeScript variable definition errors. So now that we've defined these 4 properties, they match the names of our 4 input controls. Now we can go back to our HTML, and we can set up the binding so each input is connected to the property that it shares a name with. So we'll add those 4 properties to our component. And then we're going to go and modify our form by adding Angular directives. So we're going to start with the name input. Does anybody remember? I know it was 2 weeks ago. You've done a lot since then. What is the name of the Angular directive we use to connect one form control to a specific property in the component? So we've used a couple of Angular directives here. We've used ng-for and ng-if on the left side of our page. Anybody remember we did use this code 2 weeks ago when we built our little list and form, where our data was just in memory. We weren't using any kind of back end. So how do we connect this name input that shows here? Good guess, Matt. That would work if that would be one way. If we just wanted to display the value, we would use this .name. Mike, another good guess. That's actually HTML only, but good guess. It starts with, give you a hint, it starts with NG. We can go peek at our repository for a couple of weeks ago. I know you've been busy, so if we look at our lesson 9, our standalone Angular app, right, we created a component and here was the HTML. So what was the Angular directive we added that connected one input to a property of the component? You'll see it if you look in the input tags. So we're sort of trying to replicate what we did here. You got it, Colton. So we need this ng model. This sets up the two-way data binding. So we're going to use square bracket and round bracket inside an ng model equals name. So this is going to bind and I know Visual Studio Code is saying we can't do this. It isn't known. Square bracket, round bracket. It's okay. We're going to ignore that error. We'll save that. Now this may crash our application. Now, part of what we're missing here, in order to use ng model and use our form, we need to add a new reference to our project. Again, we did this a couple of weeks ago. So our app needs to be configured to work with forms. So in order to do this, in our main application configuration file, our app.module.ts, we're going to have to go here. So app.module.ts, it keeps track of all of the Angular libraries that we're using. So we've added these. So these were imports we added. We now need to import the Angular forms module. So this ng model tag, that won't work until we import and add it to our list of imports here. And this is in our app.module.ts. So I've added lines 11 and 22. I'll see if my app, and notice once we do that, error goes away. That error saying we can't use ng model in the form. It's fine. My page will reload. Again, if I comment those out, if I just undo for a second, if I remove these things, we get this result. It says you can't use ng model, doesn't know what it is. So anytime we're going to use a form, which we're probably going to use in pretty much any application we build, we're going to need to import the forms module in app.module.ts and add it to the list of imports. So that ng model directive won't get recognized until we include this import. So now our form will load. I'm quickly just going to add the ng model directive to our other three inputs, and then we'll take a break. So we'll go back to the HTML, and I will add those ng model directives. We'll add the location, the description, and I will put this up on GitHub in a moment. And lastly, our final input, it's bound, it's tied to the website property of the component. So we've set up our two-way data binding now. So if we type in a name, whatever the current value is in our name input, that will also get passed automatically to the name property, and vice versa. If the name property is filled in our component, that value will automatically get displayed in the name text box in our form. Okay, it's 9:52. I'm going to just go to my terminal. I haven't made any changes to the server, only to the client. Lesson 11.1, form setup. So the code is now here in the, Chris, we didn't install app.js. We created app.js in the server. We just created that in code last week. So the code is on GitHub. Here's the server end if you need that, the app.js. There is no app.js in the client. Okay, so I've updated. Here's what we've done so far. Okay, Chris, we can discuss the assignment after class. Okay, I think that would be a better time for us to talk about the assignment.
Okay.